women weren't allowed to have a voice in your marriage. You weren't allowed to, mess up. Somehow the men were allowed to mess up more than the women, I seem to remember. And knowing that, as a woman, you have no voice and you just have to suck it up.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome everybody to this week's episode. My guest today was raised in a fundamentalist evangelical church. She served as a missionary with Wycliffe Bible translators for 15 years. 8.5 of those years, she was living in Brazil. She left organized religion in 2008 and separated from her missionary husband in 2009, ending a 20-year marriage. She reconnected with her high school sweetheart and started a new blended family with 5 children. In April 2017, she started the Women Beyond Belief podcast, which features women who have left religion. I'm very happy to be joined today by Wendy Marsman. Wendy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Steve. I really enjoy every opportunity I have to speak to other people who are in the same situation, who've left religion, and it seems like we have a lot in common.
Yeah. So we are both fairly new to the podcast scene. I think we both launched our podcasts in April. So
yes,
one on top of the other kind of. I would love to hear about how you got the idea for your podcast and then how you've enjoyed doing it thus far.
Okay. Well, it goes back to 2008 is when I first started listening to podcasts, and I was having questions about my religion, and I got an iPod Shuffle, which was a affordable way to listen to podcasts while I went for my walks, and I would download different podcasts, and the one I found at the beginning was the Free Believers Network with Darren Hufford, and Darren was really into the home church movement and talking to other people who were dissatisfied with regular organized religion. And so he felt, that there was a niche for people like himself. And I felt that I was starting to move in that direction. I was not happy with the Baptist church that our family was going to. And so we started going to non-denominational churches, and I ended up not going to church anymore, because I just couldn't find a place that I felt that I could, feel at home. And I started questioning my faith more related to some other issues. But anyway, so I was listening to his podcast, and then I started listening to other podcasts. And I learned so much because, I don't know, I felt like I was sitting in the room with these people who would interview other people and the co-hosts and hear their stories. And I just really liked the dynamics of podcasts in general. And then I when I actually left Christianity completely and was agnostic for about 4 years, I didn't really listen to any podcasts between, when would that be? 2010 and 2014. Mm-hmm. I listened to other types of podcasts on health or finances or whatever, but I was so scared of being sucked back into religion that I didn't listen to any religious or atheist podcasts. And then I started having some more questions and started realizing, I need to start uncovering my past because I'm living in this limbo stage. So I just, Googled agnostic and found Everyone's Agnostic podcast and started listening to Cass and Bob. And they were interesting to listen to, but I started realizing I'm a little bit past this. They were at that point when they first started their podcast, they were still very much agnostic. Well, actually, Bob was never religious in the first place, but Cass was very much in the agnostic stage. And so I sort of moved past that and started listening to Seth Andrews with his the Thinking Atheist podcast. And I think I listened to his 100 episodes, binge listened on my commute to work. And it was very, it just completely changed my worldview listening to his podcast, because he interviews, everybody and anybody. And I felt like I had to brainwash myself from what I had learned and reprogram my brain. And of course, I'm still in the process of doing that.
Yeah.
But and then of course I found other podcasts, the Friendly Atheist and Life After God and the Atheist Experience, different ones like that. So podcasts really had a big influence on me, and I really like the dynamics, like I say, of the host and if there's a co-host and the interviewees, and hearing the stories. And I also listen to other podcasts, like WTF with Mark Lauren and
so just a big podcast fan in general.
Yes, I am. Yeah. So then in 2000, we've had some health situations with our family. I had a mini stroke. My husband had a grand mal seizure, but broke his back. Then he has cancer. So we've had some hiccups in the last 3 years. And I had wanted to start the podcast about a year ago. And due to, some family situations and realizing I just didn't have, I started writing out my story. And it was so stressful, like just so emotionally draining to bring up all that past memories that I just had to put it on the back burner too. But in that time, I learned a lot, about how to create podcasts and all the, technical side.
Yeah.
So then when I finally realized, okay, I've got to find some people who are like-minded, because I literally went from having hundreds and hundreds of friends to having 3. Wow. 3 or 4 friends. So it's been a very lonely road.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so last fall, about 6 months ago, I joined the Clergy Project, and I put my bio up, and Drew Backus, who's now I think he's president or chairman of the Clergy Project, he saw in my bio that I had put, Everyone's Agnostic podcast as being one that was influential to me. So he contacted me and he said, oh, well, Cass Midley's on this Clergy Project group membership, maybe, you could, introduce yourself to him because he's interested in podcasts. So he connected me to Cass, and then Cass invited me on his podcast, and sort of the rest is history.
And that's really
sort
cool.
of got the ball rolling. Yeah.
Well, what makes you want to focus the podcast on women?
As if people have listened to any of my other interviews or even my podcast, they might get tired of me saying it over and over again. But I really feel that women don't have a voice in religion. And once they leave religion, they still feel they don't have a voice. And that's what I've experienced so much of. So I guess I feel like there's a niche. And when I wanted to start the podcast a year ago, there was a niche, and there still is a niche. I still don't see atheist podcasts aimed at women, and aimed at women having a voice. And I'm not saying that you or any of these other podcasts that are hosted by men are anti-women. I'm just saying that the main focus isn't to address the unique situation that women encounter when they leave religion. So I really felt that, there needed to be a voice, and I'd love to see, dozens of podcasts out there focusing on women and having women's voices heard more. So I hope I can, encourage others to want to start podcasts for this too, because I really, really see a need, and it's amazing how many people are starting to contact me and say, I haven't found anything else like this before, and you need to keep doing this. And so, the ball's keeping rolling and rolling. So yeah, I'm excited about the future. I did contact Karen Garst, who wrote the book called Women Beyond Belief, and just so I wasn't stealing the name from her. And she's super on board to collaborate, and she keeps sending me ideas of how to publicize the podcast more and things like that. So I'm excited where this could lead in the future, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's great. And I absolutely agree. There's just such a there's not anything that I've seen at all that aims toward women, so that as far as atheist podcasts go.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. And I'd heard you mention this before that, a lot of times women who come out of a difficult religious experience that is very patriarchal, man's the head of the house, that kind of thing, they don't feel comfortable necessarily opening up at all or opening up about certain things to a man. So having, a female host that they can, just sit down and basically have a chat with. I think there's a big need for that. And you're doing a great thing. And I'm excited about it. I was excited to see when I saw it first posted on the Life After God group. So I thought that was pretty cool. So thank you for starting it. I think that's it's really neat, and it'll be fun to see how it kind of develops, and how it grows and all that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for that encouragement. Yeah. Brian Peck, who's works alongside Ryan Bell on the Life After God team. Brian's been very encouraging of me and helped to publicize the podcast as much as he can too. So anything like that is great because, like I say, I had so few friends up until 6 months ago that I don't have a lot of connections or networking. So anybody who's contacted me recently it's just like a breath of fresh air.
Wow, that's great. That is so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I guess, well, the first thing I'd like to ask is, how do you identify yourself in regard to what label do you use to describe your religious beliefs or lack thereof?
I guess I'd say I'm an atheist. I'm not afraid to say that. When I first realized that I was not a Christian, I didn't really know what agnostic meant or any of those terms. I started to learn what they were, but I just wasn't anything. I was in limbo. So I think listening to the podcast helped me put a label on it and realize, I don't believe there's a God. I don't believe there's supernatural. I find no evidence of it. And there was a time when I wanted to join the Clergy Project, but they require you to, check the box that says you don't believe in anything supernatural. And there was a time I couldn't actually check that box. I didn't really know. And then, a year or two later, I did realize, I don't believe it anymore. I don't see any evidence for it. So I don't mind using the word atheist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, why don't you describe the religious environment of your childhood and how Christianity influenced you growing up?
Okay. Well, I'll go back to my parents. My parents were both Americans, born in California. My dad was raised near San Francisco, and my mom's family immigrated to Canada. As far as I know, it was related to something related to passivity and not wanting to encourage the war effort. And I'm not sure what year that would have been, in the 40s, something like that. So they immigrated to Canada, and my dad, my parents met at Berkeley and were part of the free speech sit-in movement in the early 60s. And then my dad was a draft dodger and immigrated to Canada in the 60s, mid 60s or so. So both my parents, were Americans. And so most of my relatives are Americans, but my parents are both immigrants. So definitely passivity, anti-war efforts were from both sides of the family. And so I grew up in a very remote area, homesteading. And
this is probably such an ignorant question to ask, but what's homesteading? I don't even know what that is.
Yeah. So my dad was taking forestry at the University of Berkeley. I'm not sure what his plan was originally when he started anyways, but he wanted to marry a Canadian and live in a log house and teach forestry. So he ended up doing that in the small town near where we lived. He taught forestry at the local high school, and he taught a forestry class where they would literally teach people how to cut the trees and load up the logging trucks and stuff. So it was in a mountainous area in western BC.
Yeah.
And so we lived off the land. We had a huge garden. We had a workhorse and goats and chickens and stuff. So we grew all of our own food. And I mean, I just remember working. I don't remember doing much playing growing up because it takes a lot of work to grow your own food and harvest it.
That's amazing.
So
Yeah, that is a lot of hard work. How many siblings did you have?
I just have an older brother.
Okay, so it's you and your older
So
brother
yeah,
and your parents, and you guys, your memories of your childhood
yeah,
revolve around a lot of work to try to keep everything going.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A huge garden, and yeah, I remember every summer basically just planting the garden, weeding the garden, harvesting the garden.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So, and
Wow.
then in the winter, because we have, 3 feet of snow, it's very much four seasons kind of an area.
Mm-hmm.
Then we do all the home crafts. And because my parents were they're very strict and very legalistic in terms of what women's roles, what men's roles were. So, I grew up seeing my mom, take care of the house and do all the cooking. I never ever saw my dad cook a meal or wash dishes. And
Mm-hmm.
well, I guess he learned to wash dishes later on, but at the beginning, there's women's jobs, men's jobs. So growing up in the evenings, we weren't allowed to watch TV, so we had to, sew or cross stitch or practice my violin or something like that. So we always had to be productive. But the academics were not encouraged. I do not ever remember seeing a children's book growing up. Like when I was really little, I don't have any memories of children's books.
Wow.
I don't remember learning the alphabet or learning, math or anything until I started school at 7.5. I remember learning to sew and bake and weed the garden, but I don't remember any academics at all.
Wow. I'm actually struck by the fact that your parents went to Berkeley, which I associate with being extremely
I know.
liberal, and they were associated with the anti-war movement, and yet they had this very strict traditional kind of belief system about the family.
Yeah. Well, my mom, when my mom's family immigrated to Canada, they did live themselves on a homestead in the interior of British Columbia, which is the western province
Yeah.
in Canada. And so she had grown up homesteading herself. But my dad, he grew up basically in the city of Lafayette, and grew up with TV, grew up with a regular, typical suburban lifestyle. But he didn't have a happy upbringing apparently. So I think he was rebelling against that and wanted to go back to nature.
Mm-hmm.
So they were hippies, they had, we had bright orange curtains in our house. And, my mom wore the big clogs and the shawls and the ponchos. And,
That's really funny.
we had the plaid, my brother had plaid pants, my mom sewed all of my clothes and her clothes, dresses, of course. So it was it was Little House on the Prairie without any of the fun. I don't remember having a lot of fun growing up because my dad was so strict.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, another thing I associate with Berkeley and liberalism and all that is feminism and,
Yeah,
women having rights and being equal to men. And yet,
yeah.
in your upbringing, it was very much a man as the head of the house environment.
Well, what's interesting is I don't know. I'm not on communicating terms with my parents right now. I haven't been for 7 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to talk to them about that now. But I do remember seeing one or two pictures of my mom wearing shorts when she was like 26. I was born when she was 27. And, my brother was, like 2 years old, and she's out in the garden with shorts on. And I never saw her wear pants or shorts until I've never seen her wear shorts ever, but she wore dresses for as long as I remembered. So what
Wow.
happened was when she was, I don't need to tell her life story, but it does impact me because it shows when she switched to religion. So
Yeah.
she was not religious up to that point, as far as I know. But she went down to see her sister get married in California, and her sister had been into drugs and into wildlife, and apparently she totally turned her life around because of Jesus during the Jesus movement down there in California. And so my mom was told by my grandma to go down and split them up at the wedding, split up the marriage, because she didn't want her to marry this radical Christian man.
Wow.
So on one weekend, my mom goes down there, at the request of her own mom to split up this marriage, and ends up becoming a radical Christian herself over the weekend
Oh,
at the
wow.
Jesus movement. So it totally turned her life around, in a short amount of time, I guess. And she just took it hook, line, and sinker, and was influenced, because we lived in this remote area. There was very fundamentalist church, Christian church. There was Seventh-day Adventists, and there was Jehovah's Witnesses, and those were like the three influences in that area. So she sort of made up her own religion, along with the evangelicalness, but we definitely were influenced by Seventh-day Adventists. We were vegetarians for a while. We never worked on Saturday. I remember that too. We'd work on Sunday, go to church on Sunday, come home and work, but Saturday we wouldn't work. So
interesting. Any idea how did Grandma respond to not getting what she wanted? She wanted that marriage to break up.
I don't know. She was a very interesting woman. I think she was a feminist in her own way, but she was so angry. Like, she was a very difficult person to get along with. I remember her and my dad getting into big arguments and stuff, but so I don't know. She didn't get her way.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So you were talking about, your dad wanted to be a homesteader and he taught forestry, and you grew up basically living off the land. In a very, I guess, traditional, you could say, upbringing. And you've talked a little bit about how religion was incorporated in that. What are some other ways that Christianity influenced you as you grew?
So because it was a small town, and there was very few churches or anything, and it was a town of 2,000 people, and we lived 20 minutes away. So everything revolved around home or the church in that little town. The church maybe had 50 people. And so there wasn't, my dad was, and this is where I don't, like I said, I'm not in contact with my dad, but it would be interesting to hear why he felt this way. But he really didn't want me and my brother to go to the public school, even though he was a public school teacher. And I asked my mom about it before I left religion. And she said, oh, it's because he didn't want you kids to, be wearing T-shirts that had, bad language on them, or, be influenced by the drugs or something. So he wanted to protect us somehow from, the bad things about public school. So, me and my brother never went to a public school because of his opinion.
Which is interesting, because you've said that he doesn't believe in God.
No.
Yeah, he wanted to protect you with like these religious rules or whatever.
Yeah, he would say, "Oh, I've got a Bible on my desk at school," so that, like, he wanted to be open-minded, but he didn't want to ever say there was a God. He definitely would say, "I worship nature, and the forest is my church," and that kind of thing. So I really don't know what kind of an atheism that is.
Yeah,
but
kind of his own unique version.
Yeah, so my parents both sort of created their own religion, which now, in hindsight, I realize that every Christian basically does, because no two Christians believe the same verses and such.
Yeah.
So because he claimed to be an atheist, and because of some other situations where I never ever got along well with him, then I had a bad taste in my mouth about the term atheism growing up, because he was the only one I knew who was an atheist. So
I got you off track. I digressed a little bit. I do that from time to time. But you were saying it was small town, and your dad didn't want you to go to the public school to protect you guys from, the drugs and the influence of, secular society. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, all the bad things that come with public school, in his opinion. So
yeah, so when I was 7.5, my parents helped start a church school in the basement of the church. And there was about 20 kids at the beginning. That I think it grew to maybe 30 or 35, but it was always one room, grade 1 to 12. And so my brother and I started going to that school, and it's a really not a good school. ACE, Accelerated Christian Education, was the curriculum they used. It's an American curriculum. I'm not sure where it was founded, but incredibly racist, incredibly Bible-oriented, and not up to par with, the standards of education at the time. So, wow. And incredibly strict. So I don't know if you're familiar with this school at all, but you sit in little booths, in essence, where there's this wooden divider, so you can't see the person sitting next to you.
Whoa.
And you face forward at this desk, and you have to be completely quiet while you work at your course material. And then if you want to go to the bathroom, you put this little flag up, and then the monitors will come around and they'll let you go to the bathroom. And if you needed to score your work, you scored all your own work from these booklets, then you'd have to put your little flag up, and then you could go up to the station and score your work. So, and you'd have to set goals every day for how much you thought you would get through for the next day.
Wow.
So at the age of 7.5, well, actually grade 1, there was 5 of us in our grade 1 class. I don't think we were in the little cubicles. So 8.5 started grade 2. Here you're supposed to set a goal for how much you're going to get done that day. And if you don't get it done, you have to take that home as homework. So I became a workaholic and incredibly driven at a very, very young age because, well,
you had to be.
You had to be in order, because it was completely work at your own pace. And probably some people weren't that way. But anyway, so I remember actually feeling like I was burning out at like age 9.
Oh, no. That's so sad.
Because I would give myself way too much work, and I've had tons of homework, and oh my goodness. So I actually did grade 2 and 3 in 1 year. I was like really driven for that. So,
wow.
But and so there's no interaction. The teachers they need 2 weeks of training. So they aren't actually teachers. So none of the people at the school. So my mom has a sociology degree,
wow,
but she doesn't have a teacher's degree. And she was underneath the principal, like she was supervisor. So that's like the step below the principal. And then what they call the other teachers, quote, were monitors. But all they would require is just giving you permission to go to the bathroom or giving you permission to, go score your work. So there was no interaction between an adult and the students, and no interaction between the students either. So
wow,
it's such a weird environment. And of course, that's all I knew. I didn't know it was weird. That was. I look back. I still am starting to uncover things that go back to that type of a learning environment, and how it has shaped me, in my own life. And there was, I think, in the 7 years that we were at that school, I think we went through 5 principals, and my mom was, on the hiring committee, and there was some really bad stuff that went on. And, I put a lot of blame on my parents for, being, yes, highly educated. They both had degrees. They were both, well, my mom was the first one out of her family that had a post-secondary education. So, they knew better than to put us in that school. And, but nope, we kept going. So my brother actually graduated from that. And when he tried to go to college later on, he didn't pass the entrance exams because the school didn't, prepare him enough for it. So I have a lot of anger, that still comes up today about all of that crap. And
no, understandably so. I mean, did he eventually get into college or? Oh
yeah. My brother, he actually ended up getting his master's. He's quite successful now as a landscape architect and city planner right now. So yeah, he's gone on and done very well. But also my parents encouraged him to go to university, whereas I was never encouraged to go to university. So going back to the church was called a missionary church, which was part of a denomination at the time that was called missionary churches. And there was 4 of them in the region that we were at. And all of them had church schools as well. And then I think lately the missionary church joined, and now it's called Evangelical Missionary Church. So every Sunday night we'd have a missionary come and, tell about what it was like to live in Africa or Brazil or, Indonesia or Papua New Guinea. And so I had a very intense environment in that the only Christians you got to know were in this little church and or missionaries, because that was our outside influence basically. And so from a young age, I was definitely encouraged to see missionaries as being, the ultimate goal for Christians. Mm-hmm. And my mom definitely encouraged that too. And then when we moved, when I was 14, we moved to Vancouver Island. And I was homeschooled 1 year and then went to a regular Christian school for 3 years. And at that time, I was influenced by lots of different denominations and went on 3 short-term mission trips. So that was a really big turning point. If we had stayed in that small town, I don't know where I'd be right now.
So it was a good move to, I mean,
Definitely.
obviously, I mean, that school sounded so isolating and just so like unhealthy, you know?
Yeah, it was.
So even though you're going to another Christian school, I mean, at least it's not as bad as that first one.
No. And I remember grade 10 was the first time, I was in a regular classroom with 30 students and there was a teacher up front. And I was so shocked that kids were allowed to talk to each other or allowed to talk to the teacher because I was so unfamiliar with that.
Wow. And your parents didn't give you any hint that, hey, it might be a little different at this school.
No.
Just like shocked you.
Yeah, it was a big shock. But I love, those 3 years were fantastic years for me because I felt like I came out into the real world in a lot of ways and was exposed to, it was a Christian Reformed school, and the Christian Reformed denomination was so much more liberal than what I had been used to. My friends would smoke at break time and they would say, they'd say, shut up or shit. Those were terrible swear words. We'd get spanked for saying those in my family.
Yeah.
So they just were so much more liberal than what I was used to. So it was good. It was good for me to see that
that's
other
cool.
side of Christianity.
Yeah. So so how long were you at that first school then? You were there about 7 years old until 14?
Yeah.
Okay, and then 14, you moved to Vancouver Island, which is actually not far from where I'm at. I'm in the like Seattle-Tacoma area.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Washington State. So, but anyway, and I know you're not there anymore, but anyway, you were at Vancouver Island, going to this Christian Reform school, and is that where you graduated from high school then?
Yeah, I graduated there.
Okay.
And so, the people that influenced me, I know that was one of your questions in the future, but the person that influenced me in high school was the Youth for Christ leader, and he was in charge of the 3 mission trips that I went on. And it was on those mission trips that I really felt like, okay, I want to do this full time. I want to be a career missionary. What does it involve? And I was really involved with music. My mom was always the choir director wherever we were, and I played the violin and sang in quartets and quintets and all that kind of thing. So I felt like, music is maybe where I need to, or that would be the avenue to get me to the mission field.
Yeah.
And so, two of the three mission trips involved taking a Youth for Christ choir, to the location where we went to. So.
Okay. So that's kind of how you got your foot in the door as far as getting exposed to the mission field and that lifestyle. Yeah.
And so, and working, I think the one that influenced me the most was the 3rd trip that I went on. I was, 18, and we went to Bogota, Colombia, and worked with Prison Fellowship. The choir director of the Youth for Christ choir was related to a family that went with prison ministry there in Bogota. And so we went and sang to the inmates in these jails, and it was very shocking, the standard of or lack of standard of sanitation, et cetera, that they had was terrible. But it made me see that, there was a bigger world out there compared to the small world I had grown up in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I had any other goals. Like if someone had said, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Basically, okay, well, I'll be like my mom. I'll grow up, get married and have kids and, be on the mission field.
So you said that this Youth for Christ leader and then also that 3rd trip really influenced you. What was it about that person and about that trip that really pulled you in and really got you hooked?
The people who worked with Prison Fellowship, were missionaries themselves in Bogota. So I saw how their family, interacted and what it was like for them as missionaries, because we worked with them while we were in Bogota and saw their lifestyle. And I thought, I could do this. This would be, what it's like to be a missionary in another country. And I don't know, I guess it was just the people I was influenced by were also wanting to be missionaries. I had a boyfriend at one point who wanted to be a missionary in Japan. And some of my friends, were either missionary kids or were planning on going to the mission field. So it was sort of, you become like the people you're with, and you encourage other people in that event too.
Yeah.
The Youth for Christ leader, him and his wife were living on support themselves as full-time staff with Youth for Christ. So they were, home-based missionaries is what we would call them.
And when you say support, I assume you mean the home church is the one funding their mission.
Not necessarily a home church, but no, support meaning support missionaries aren't frontline missionaries, and that's how we use that term.
Oh, okay.
The two meanings of the word support. Support meaning, yes, you're being supported by people, individuals and or churches. It usually was never just one church. I think in the old days, in the 50s and 60s, probably people could go to the mission field with one church supporting them, but it's cost so much now. Wow. That you got to have, a lot more. We actually, by the end, when we were missionaries, we had 15 churches and 350 different people supporting us. So,
whoa, that's crazy. We had missionaries come to our church, but they were like from our church, and I just as a kid thought like, our church helps support them, and they go off to Africa or wherever, and then they come back from time to time. And I had no idea that you would have to get support from 15 churches. So. I think I've heard you talk about this. You probably had to go around and basically try to get funding, right?
Well, we're jumping ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No. I could get off on that whole topic if you want. So, or do you want to do this chronologically?
Let's go chronologically. That works fine. Yeah, we can get into that later.
This is a complicated story.
That's okay. No, it's good. It's really fascinating.
So yeah, from then, my mom really encouraged me to go to, actually right after high school, I went to culinary cooking school because my dad thought, well, if you're going to be a mom, it would be good if you get some, training in how to be a better cook, So I thought, okay, that's a good thing. I'll do that. And then after working in a restaurant, I hated it. So my mom encouraged me to go to a Bible college and, take music and take Bible training, in the goal of becoming a missionary long term. So I did go to Bible college, and 2 weeks in, I met my future husband, and that sort of changed my trajectory. My first husband was a missionary kid from Papua New Guinea. So I sort of thought, okay, well, this is definitely a foot in the door already, because he knows what, his parents were with Wycliffe Bible translators. So I thought, okay, this is a good step towards becoming a missionary myself. Yeah. And, so we got married right after the first year of Bible college, and joined Wycliffe 1992, and we were missionaries with Wycliffe from 1992 to 2007.
Wow.
And so it was quite an adventure. I look back at it and I think, oh my goodness, how did I do that? It was so much work to raise 3 kids overseas, and it was an adventure for sure.
And when you went on these missions to Brazil, for how long at a time would you stay in Brazil?
So we started out, my husband and I weren't Bible translators, so we had to take a 1-month training course in 1992 to see if, we had any aptitude for that. And neither of us, really were into the literacy side, but my husband was into construction. And I had, various, skills of sorts. I wasn't really trained anything other than cooking. But I was a seamstress since I'd done that, since I was really little. So, but being a wife of the missionary, you go for the sake of what your husband can do. So there's always jobs for the wives to do on the mission field. But you really go based on what your husband's capable of doing. So if, the husband's a pilot, then you're the pilot family, and the wife will do various jobs. And so we went because my husband was going to be in charge of the maintenance and construction on the mission base in Brazil. So we went there. My son was 9 months old when we first moved to Brazil, and I got pregnant with our second child 2 months after we arrived. And so I was pregnant and delivered our daughter Sarah that first year that we were there. And because it's really hard to get visas in Brazil, we were able to get a permanent visa because she was born in Brazil, whereas most people find it really hard to get. You have to go on a tourist visa and then get them renewed, that kind of a thing, or you can't even get them. So So they call it a visa baby. And there was quite a few other missionaries who, had babies down there for that, for that reason.
Wow.
They don't like it. The Brazilians, don't want people to just come and have babies for that reason.
Right.
There was actually one time when I think I was 4 months pregnant, and we had to get our tourist visa renewed, and we had to leave the country. So we flew in the little Cessna 206 plane over to the Bolivia border and took a little boat, that could hold like 8 people across this river with all the rapids, and went to the little tiny, tiny consulate on the other side in Bolivia, got the, visa stamped, and then crossed back over and, tried to make it not look that I was pregnant when we got that visa renewal.
Oh, man.
It was quite a bit of a story.
Because they would have probably denied it, knowing that.
Well, they might have denied it. Yeah. Because they don't want people just to take advantage of that system. So anyway.
And so this maybe gets back to what we were getting at earlier, but would you spend several years there and then, or would you spend most of the year there and then come back to Canada, in the summertime? Or I mean, how's that all work?
So yeah, back in, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so I'll give a bit of background. So for instance, my husband's family, when they first went to Papua New Guinea, they would go on the ship. It would take 2 or 3 weeks to get over to Papua New Guinea. And then once, people could afford airfare, then people would usually go for about 4 years and then come back for 1 year. And that was the cycle for many missions do that. And there were some of the people in our mission that did that, but it got a little bit more flexible based on, airfare either being easier, or it wasn't cheaper, but it was easier to, book the flights and stuff. And for us, when we first went, we didn't have any language training. We didn't know Portuguese at all. And initially we went as short-term assistants, because they recommend that in our mission, that people go and test it out to see if you like it. Mm-hmm. And so we came back and we had to take 4 months of training in North Carolina at the mission center there, to become full career missionaries with the program. And then we went back, got language training, were there for 3 years. And then because the mission base, there was only, 2 construction people, then we had to coordinate with the other construction family. So when my husband was there, they would go on furlough and vice versa. So that's sort of why we would only go for 2 or 3 years at a time, based on making sure that there was at least someone doing the maintenance and construction on the mission base.
Okay.
So we never did a 4-year stint. And then one other time we came back just for 3 months, because my husband's parents were having their wedding anniversary. And so we had a very quick furlough.
Okay. So yeah, like 3 years in Brazil, yeah. And then come home for normally about a year.
In the first time we did come home for a year, because we were taking the training. The second time was for a year, and the third time was just 3 months. So, okay. And the second time we went back, I got pregnant with my third child, my daughter. We had her there as well. Ended up being the exact same delivery room. It's a tiny little private hospital, and thankfully, I didn't have any complications with the birth of those 2 girls in Brazil. Some people certainly did not recommend it because there was we lived in a near a northern city. It was about half an hour drive to the city, and the city had 400,000 people, but it was incredibly poor.
Okay, so this is your life. You're a missionary. You spend years in the field, supporting your husband as he does this kind of construction mission work, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you're raising your kids there. And then, so you were there for about 15 years.
Yeah. Altogether, like I say, I counted it up, and the actual time we were in Brazil was about 8.5 of those years. Cause like I said, we had to come back for furlough and training, and, we took Portuguese training. And so, yeah, my kids have a lot of strong memories of being there
Mm-hmm.
because the two oldest were, I think 10 and 11 when we came back. My youngest was 6, so she doesn't have as many memories.
Okay.
But it was very much a part of their upbringing. So they do identify, as missionary kids themselves, even though they have friends who kept living there, into their teen years. But we came to this point where there just wasn't good schooling there. One of my jobs was to help out at the mission school. And because the visas were hard to get, then the moms would help take turns teaching from a American school curriculum at the international school there. There was like about 30 or 40 students from 3 different missions. And so, yeah, the moms would all help out teaching and that kind of thing. And there just wasn't anything for high school. There wasn't enough students to make up, to warrant having a high school teacher come down.
Yeah.
And so many of the students would go like so there was 12 different languages in that area that our mission base supported. And so there were, 12 different couples, families, and or single women who were missionary translators for those 12 different languages. And they would either go by 4-wheel drive and or by the Cessna 206 airplane into the village. They'd be there for 4 to 8 weeks, and they'd come back to the mission base and, get a bit of a break, be able to concentrate more on the language training, and then go back. So they would go back and forth. And so for certain families, they felt it better, instead of taking their kids in and out of a school and homeschooling them while they were in the village, they would just send them off to a boarding school that was in a town further north.
Oh.
And we, because my husband and I worked on the mission base, there wasn't a reason to send the kids away because we weren't going into a village. But because there wasn't any teachers, we really felt like, we need our kids to be in a school that has actual teachers.
Wow.
So in Papua New Guinea, they have a very large mission base there with a high school of 1,000 kids. And so it's really, really large.
Wow.
Well, no, let me see. I think the mission base has 1,000 people, so 500 kids or something.
Yeah, still that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we thought, okay, let's just change routes, let's go to another mission and see if that would, be a better place for our kids, to finish high school. So we came back to Canada with all the intention of, taking 6 months, getting the visas for Papua New Guinea and going to Papua New Guinea to finish, have our kids go to high school there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we came back and it was so dramatic for us to leave Brazil. It was so hard because that had been home for, our kids. They only knew kids in Brazil. We never came back or stayed anywhere long enough for them to really have any friends in Canada. So leaving Brazil was such a grieving process, and we didn't realize it. So when we came back, we just had terrible reverse culture shock, and it was really a tough time for our family. And so we realized, okay, forget it. Let's not go to Papua New Guinea. Let's just settle down and let the kids, go to school in Canada. So yeah, so that was a challenging time because I want to do actually a podcast on my own platform related to how religion screws up your finances, because it really, really screwed up my finances personally and as a family.
Yeah.
Related to the fact that we were told early on that, missionaries need to not have a home. You need to be so dedicated to God that you're going to depend on him every time you come home on furlough. Trust God, to provide for your needs, to provide a home for you. And so we never had a home. We never had, taken the time to invest in a house. And, I wish we had, because, of course, in the early 90s, things were actually affordable back then.
Yeah.
And so we'd come back and we would rely on family to, put us up in their basement suite, or we would travel around in a borrowed RV. Or we'd stay with family or friends. So we just were always in transition whenever we came back to Canada. And so we were living in a parsonage of the Baptist church when we came back the last time. And we really felt like, okay, we got to put some roots down. But we had no credit score because we weren't allowed to have debt also. When you're with this mission particularly, you aren't allowed to have any debt unless you already had a pre-existing, a mortgage or something like that. And so we had no credit score. We had to have paid off we did have Visa cards because we used those to buy our tickets, our plane tickets, but we would have them paid off every month, because you weren't allowed a debt. So, when we went and said, okay, well, let's buy a starter home, the bank said, well, who are you? You don't have any credit rating. So
wow.
They said, okay, well, why don't you get a car loan? Because that's a good way to, get some credit. So we thought, okay, let's get a car loan. So for 3 months, we paid interest on a car loan, and they said, okay, well, that's good enough. So then we got a starter home, tiny little 800 square foot home.
Wow.
And, finally felt like, okay, we're going to sort of be, teach our kids what it's like to be Canadians now. So my daughter, I don't know if you've heard her interview.
Yep. Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, she talks about what that was like for her, and, you do things as parents and you don't always know the repercussions in the kids' lives.
I have 2 sons and they're teenagers.
Okay.
And, there's always things you look back on and it's like, oh, I wish we would have done this different or that different. And you speak to finances. And of course, I went into a lot of school debt to go to get my bachelor's degree in biblical studies. And of course, when I first deconverted, I was just like, that was a complete waste. I'm in debt now, thousands and thousands of dollars for years to come, and for something I'll never use, and I've since, come to terms with that. A lot of people don't use their degrees, and it did actually help me get some different jobs that required just a general degree. So it worked out okay, but in some sense, it's like, oh my God, like, if you kind of go really, really, if you're really fervent about your faith, it can have repercussions like this financially.
Yeah. And so when we actually first started raising support back in our early 20s, and we were just getting ready to go to the mission field, our home church, or the church that we'd been going to for 3 years, the missions committee said, oh, you don't really need to, save any money for retirement. God's going to meet your needs. So we didn't even save any money for retirement for all those 15 years we were on the mission field too.
Wow.
Thankfully, at that point in time, our mission was accredited, is a nonprofit organization in Canada. And so at least when the money would come into the mission from our supporters, they would take off at least money for the Canada Pension Plan.
Okay.
But
so there was something, but not a lot.
My husband's parents, when they first joined Wycliffe, the mission wasn't putting any money aside at all. So they had, zero pension put away. Wow. So, and my father-in-law, his motto was, if he would say this over and over, if you have money in the bank, where's your faith? And so he lived that way, and we lived that way. And we just thought, oh, we're, God's going to provide. And, we come back and we have zero money, zero debt, but zero money, no credit score. And sort of, and we're, my husband was already 40 by that time. And, we're starting from scratch, basically.
You said when you left Brazil, it was with all the intention of going back. But then when you got to Canada, you realized we need to grow some roots here. And so you'd wanted to be a missionary pretty much your whole life. And so what was your goal at that point for yourself, as far as what were you going to do with your life at that point?
Yes, well, our whole marriage was built on the fact that we were planning on both being on the mission field. So for 2 years, my husband was a representative for the mission in Southern Ontario in Canada. So he would go to churches and mission conferences, and my goal mainly was to volunteer at the church and write the prayer letters. So for 2 years, we tried that. And then there was a point where they wanted us to move to the East Coast of Canada and start a new mission base that they were going to use for training. And then, our kids were already in a school for 2 years, and it was like, no, I don't want to uproot my kids anymore. And it didn't seem like my husband was really, enjoying being the representative.
Yeah.
And because he had grown up in the mission field, he was not comfortable in Canada. He never really felt like he fit in. And so it just wasn't a good fit. So I said, I'm leaving the mission. I have nothing to write prayer letters about anymore. We're not really doing anything. He wanted to keep going with the mission, but I said, okay, fine, you write your own prayer letters because I don't have anything to write about. And so we resigned from the mission in the late 2007. And it was a hard time because my husband didn't have a college degree. I didn't have a college degree. And so, minimum wage jobs were the only thing that we could really rely on. Yeah. And it's expensive to raise 3 kids and to live in our society. So we went into debt pretty quick, and because we didn't have good financial advice growing up, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, it's totally understandable. I mean, that's what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So up to this point, I mean, that's your world. How would you describe your personal relationship with God?
I mean, I accepted Jesus, when I was 7 and felt like I was, as dedicated a Christian as anybody else. I look back at it now and realize I didn't see God as a loving father because I didn't have a loving father. I didn't know what that was like. So I definitely think I had a fear of God more than, seeing that loving side. So I was a people pleaser, so make everybody happy, do things for people. Serve God, serve people, serve the church, and hopefully you'll get into heaven. But I always had that nagging feeling, what if I haven't done enough? What if I haven't prayed enough? And, I had different influences over the years from more fundamentalists or others who weren't as fundamental, so I would, definitely into the lordship, the way of thinking where, God has to be, or Jesus has to be Lord of every area of your life, and, pray all the time. I remember when my kids were really little, I would just be praying out loud a lot of the time and thanking Jesus all the time.
But it was more of a fear-based. It wasn't like necessarily a loving relationship with God that you felt you had.
No, and I think that's where me and my mom were different, because I see my mom, even now still, she's definitely very much religious. I think she saw Jesus as her husband in some ways. I know some women see that, where if they don't have a good relationship with their husband, like they put that on Jesus, and Jesus becomes the lover and their husband, and they do everything in that mindset. I definitely never felt that. I just saw him as a God that I needed to serve, and, Jesus was his son, and I needed to serve him and please him and make him happy kind of thing. So very all-consuming, in that when I left religion, there was this huge, huge void because I couldn't be praying all the time, because I literally would pray all the time, day and night, and pray about everything. And that still comes up. I'll catch myself praying.
Yeah.
I don't even realize it.
It's bizarre because it's just a habit that you've built in.
Yeah, it is.
So when did, I guess, the doubts begin to sneak in? When did you start to have questions about your faith? So
I guess going back to in Brazil, when I was probably my 31, 32, my husband had an emotional affair with my best friend. And that was really, really devastating for me to have that happen and not feel I could have a voice, because it would have affected our career. And I felt that was sort of the first wedge in my faith, I think, because I felt like, women weren't allowed to have a voice in your marriage. You weren't allowed to mess up. You weren't allowed to have an affair. And if you did, you had to forgive. Somehow the men were allowed to mess up more than the women, I seem to remember. And just knowing that, as a woman, you have no voice and you just have to suck it up. And then when he had his second affair, after we'd come back from Brazil while we were in Canada, and both times it was incredibly devastating, because I'm married for life. I assumed that our marriage would last, even though it was never a good marriage. It was, bad from the beginning. But, I saw my mom, and she had a pretty bad marriage. It was, quote, unequally yoked, as we used to use those words. And, she would always tell me, you just keep loving God and keep loving your husband and everything will be fine. And for that to happen twice to me, I don't know, it was really, I never really recovered from that. And I couldn't tell anybody. And that was, it was just this thing in the back of my brain that I knew I had my heart broken, but I can't tell anybody. And so only God and I know, or, God and my husband. And so I think that was the first part. The second part happened the next summer when my mom told me that I went to visit my mom, and she said, I don't know if the Bible's inerrant. I don't know if it's the inerrant word of God. I don't know if Jesus is God, but I still believe in God. I'm still a Christian. And that was such a shock to me because my mom was with me every single day of my life up until the age of 14. So she was an incredible, huge influence on me. And I looked up to her as my mentor in Christianity. And for her to say that, I didn't know the thought process, that she had gotten to, because we were over in Brazil all of the time. And we would, find out that she was becoming more liberal. And that was such a shock for a fundamentalist to hear.
Yeah.
You never, ever would say that Jesus isn't God. That's like heresy. So,
wow.
So that was, I just remember feeling so devastated. But what it did was it allowed me to start to doubt. And I had never allowed myself to doubt before that. I would always push my doubts aside and, suck it up and just say, this is, it could be worse, and I'll just keep going. So that was 2008. And then 2009, the second change was when my father basically accused me of, malnutrition with my daughter. My younger daughter and I went and visited my parents, and my daughter's a picky eater, and she didn't eat the food that my mom was feeding. And my dad basically said, well, I could call social services and have her taken away from you. And, you're not being a good parent, and all this kind of thing. And I he basically wanted me to do what he did, because we got spanked if we didn't eat, growing up. So, you weren't allowed to be a picky eater. And so, I was much more laid back with that with my kids, because I didn't like having that restriction anyway. So that was a turning point for me, realizing, well, he doesn't know what it's like to be a parent in today's society, and parents aren't doing that anymore. They're not spanking their kids. Well, let's hope so.
Yeah.
But none of my friends were spanking their kids for not eating their food. I think I might have with my two older ones when I was really strict when they were young. And I've apologized to them, because I was just doing what I had been taught and doing what I had been trained to do. But I slowly was becoming more, laid back. And then, of course, I found out that my dad had molested me and my brother when we were really young, and my mom had kept that a secret. And then my mom said, no, I'm going to stay with your dad, and you better forgive him. And, so there's just a lot of shit going on. And I got to that point where I said, if God is really a God who, is supposedly a loving father, why on earth would he allow, my mother to basically turn her back on me and my brother and didn't deny that something happened, but by her staying with my dad, she sort of did deny it. So I don't know. I wish I could go back and look at my thought process back there and where it, derailed. Yeah. My brother and I hadn't really talked to each other hardly at all for like 15 years, because when we left that little town, he left Christianity as well. And he went through some really rough times, and my parents were not on his side. And they pitted me against him. He was into the New Age movement. He's not a good person. Don't hang out with him. Don't connect with him.
Wow.
So I sort of was, didn't have a lot of connection with him for most of the years we were in Brazil. We would, see each other once in a while, but it was like very distant. And so I reconnected with my brother, and it was like this, can of worms was open, because, oh my goodness, we went through the same things growing up. I actually have someone who can relate. Yeah, it was very, very meaningful to me to reconnect with him.
And was that before you deconverted, or was that kind of during
Yeah,
that
it was
process?
in that between 2009, 2010, in that time period. So he was part of my deconversion process in a way, not that he was forcing me or telling me to leave Christianity,
Right.
but he was just someone who had already left Christianity and already had gone through years of therapy and counseling to,
Oh,
get over all of his, problems from growing up in that background. So I sort of relied on him a lot
yeah.
to help me through it.
Actually that's really cool because it feels like your parents kind of in a sense turned their back on their kids and took sides. They made it an
Yes.
us versus them thing where instead of saying, "Hey, we're all in this together, let's all work through this," it was more like, "I'm going to stay with your dad. You need to forgive him.
Yeah.
Your brother's new agey and you need to stay away from him." And it's like they just drew these lines and
Oh, yeah.
divided the family.
Yeah. Yeah. I never saw how judgmental and bigoted they were until after I left religion. And actually I could start to, because I grew up in that background where you cannot question your parents, with the Bill Gothard and the James Dobson mindset. You can't question. You don't dare question, because that's a sin to question your parents. So you assume that they're right. You assume that everything they say is right. For instance, my mom would always say, don't have sex before marriage because that's a sin. So I just assumed that my parents hadn't had sex before marriage. They never talked about it. I never had good sex education at all, knew nothing about anything. I was so naive. And when I was 22, I found out they had lived together for the 6 of their 7 months they were engaged.
Wow.
And I just assumed, they were perfect. So much of my childhood was just, sheltered and basically living a lie in so many
It's
ways.
kind of like the curtain got pulled back, like,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, not only in that way, but with your marriage, with your parents and all this going on, and then finding out that your mom was actually doubting some of her beliefs. I can see how that would completely pull the rug out from under you and make you feel unsettled and, okay, well, what do I believe? What's going on? Like, how do I feel about all this?
Yeah. Well, and leaving, and that's the thing. I left my marriage and left Christianity at very similar times, which was, I don't recommend that to anybody. If you can at all change, if you can change your trajectory for people, because it's such a shock to everyone else around you. And I think if I had left my religion, left my marriage and then stayed in the church, I actually would have had a lot of support, because there were single moms. You weren't allowed to get remarried, of course, if they couldn't prove that one had had an affair.
Yeah.
And an emotional affair in the church was not provable. It was sort of frowned upon, but it wasn't seen as adultery. And so if I had had the divorce first, I think it would have been a lot easier. Whereas I left religion and was separated from my husband within the same year. And it was just such a shock for everybody to, accept and stuff.
Uh-huh. What was the final straw for you as far as religion goes?
Well, I emailed my mom 3 or 4 months, 3 or 4 months after that last visit I had. And my dad had written a long letter. He was so mad. We were sleeping in a tent out in the backyard, my daughter and I, because it was really nice, warm weather. And my dad didn't even help us take the tent down. And we went and stayed at a campground. And that was, he went and pouted in his room and wrote a letter. And that's the last I've ever seen of him. Like he's, to me, he's abandoned me. He wants nothing to do with me. He hasn't ever tried to contact me. But then I look at the trajectory of his relationship with me. It's always been moderated by my mom.
Oh.
And so the only argument I ever remember my mom and dad having, I remember hearing my mom say, well, you never wanted kids. So I don't think we were ever really wanted. He was
Wow.
very, very misogynistic and chauvinistic and bigoted and racist and not a nice man.
That's super hurtful. That all kind of became a realization around that time when you guys went to their house and you were staying there. You said in the backyard,
Yeah.
Like in a tent or whatever. And that was kind of when you kind of realized, like, maybe he never wanted kids. Maybe he, like you said, your mom had kind of mitigated some of the difficulties between you and your father, it sounds like.
Well, that was the start of it. I didn't realize that that would be the last contact I had with my dad, but I didn't even argue. At that point, I was, my marriage wasn't in a good point. Things were just not good at home, which was one of the reasons I was visiting them. And I told my dad, I knew he was going to have an argument with me. And I said, Dad, I'm, 95% close to breaking point already. I don't know what you have to say to me, but just understand that. Well, he didn't care. He just laid into me about what a bad mom I was. And, at the end of what he said, I just said, fine, I'm leaving early. I had nothing to say because he could win every argument. He's very analytical. He was a science teacher, and I could never win an argument with him. And
that was you were with your daughter. Was that the same trip that you were with your daughter, or a different trip?
Yeah. She thankfully didn't hear most of the argument, but she heard enough, and it scarred her a little bit too, because she realizes, she was 8, I think, at the time, but it just was not a good situation. But I just realized that's the man he always was. I just never allowed myself to see it because I had to keep these rose-colored glasses on to say, oh, he's my father. I need to be the good Christian daughter. I need to keep giving. And it sort of took the blinders off for me to see I don't have to give to this man anymore. Just because he's my blood relative does not mean that I'm going to treat him, any differently than somebody else who would treat me this way, So I have no desire to contact him. I don't even know if he's still alive. I don't know where he lives. I think I know where he lives because of but I mean, like I said, I'm not having contact with him because he's toxic to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's been healing for me to be able to just write him out of my life, because it's like, if he wants to be part of my life, he's better start treating me as he would treat another adult. My parents both have never gotten to the point where they see me as an adult. They see my brother as an adult. They treat him very differently than they treat me, and always have.
Wow.
So I grieve that, not having parents in my life right now, especially with, my kids growing up, and they don't, they do have some interaction with my mom, even though I don't, but my dad, he's just not part of our life at all. He's just not there.
That's really too bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that. That must be really heartbreaking and difficult and all of that.
It is. It is.
That was the final straw. When did you realize you didn't believe in God anymore?
I think it was that fall of 2009 into 2010 where I just I don't want to have anything to do with this God anymore. So I was still going to church up until the spring. And then I decided, I just don't want to really go to church anymore. It's really hard to hold on to your faith when you don't have Christians around you every Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So, and then my brother, we were emailing a lot, and I just sort of was realizing I don't want this anymore. And I'd already told my husband we aren't going to be married anymore. And I don't know.
The marriage fell apart just before you lost your faith.
Yeah. So I had already left, the church, the traditional church. We were trying to find, a church outside of that, or home church or whatever.
Yeah.
And then, I lost my faith basically. Mm-hmm. And just, I guess I sort of in some ways walked away from the faith by walking out of the doors of that Baptist church and saying, I don't want to be part of that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's all a bit of a jumble because, I knew so few people that weren't Christians too. Like, I think my daughter was in hockey. My kids were in, air cadets and soccer and stuff. So I did have a little bit of interaction with people who weren't Christians, but it was, 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week. And they weren't really friends. And
you couldn't really confide in them or tell anybody how you were feeling.
No, because a lot of them, had always been, not churchgoers, or else they went to the United Church. So, we believe in God, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, what was the most difficult part about this entire time in your life?
Just basically being written out of a family, like my in-laws. They would come and visit us all the time. They lived just down the street. And, my husband's from a family of 5 kids. There's 19 grandkids. And, we'd have big family gatherings. And basically when I walked out of that house, because I had asked my husband to leave, for 6 months, and he never wanted to leave. So I was like, okay, if you're not leaving, I have to leave. I can't put up with this anymore. And basically from that point on, I had lost all of those relatives, all of his family, because they sided with him. Even though I would get a letter once in a while that said, oh, we believe you, we believe that he cheated on you, and we believe your story, but they didn't act it out. They still stood their ground because they really believe in blood is thicker than water. Yeah. And I even got a letter from my father-in-law saying, oh, your dad should be happy because now you're back in his clan, because he was really into, people being in clans. So it was like, you're not in my family anymore. Now you're back in your father's family. So that was really, really hard to be written out of that whole family environment.
Well, and Wendy, at the same time, now you're losing like you said, you lost all your friends. So, that's crushing, because that's like a double blow. You lose your family on both sides, essentially. Yeah. And then also all of your church friends.
Yeah. It was hard. And before that, I had reconnected in the 2008 trip out west. At this point, we were living in Ontario, which is where we'd come back to from Brazil. And so my parents and the school I'd gone to were on the West Coast. And so I went to my high school reunion, 20-year high school reunion. We reconnected with this guy I had dated when I was 17. And so when I was listening to the Darren Hufford podcasts, I started to email him, and we were talking about Christianity and theology. And I just saw him as a brother in Christ. And after I separated from my husband, then he, admitted he had feelings for me. So we dated long distance. And then I moved to the West Coast again from Ontario. And we blended a family. And he has 2 kids. I had 3 kids. And at one point we had 7 of us living in a 3-bedroom townhouse. And so that was a good change. And I started to, have a few more friends at work, and went to college for a year. So I left that environment that was so toxic for me, in terms of everybody was, all my friends and my in-laws, just sort of turned their back on me, and I just didn't connect with them at all. So I needed that change. It was hard for our family, but I'm very glad I did it.
Yeah. And would you say that was probably the most helpful thing during that time? Because I know from hearing your story before that all of this happened within months. I mean, the marriage and ended, and then you decided you didn't believe in God anymore, and it was several months later that you reconnected with your high school sweetheart, right?
Yeah, between 2008 and 2010 was when everything happened, in terms of going from being a devout Christian to being, a non-Christian and being separated. So, yeah, it was a short period of time overall. I look back and I think I could have done things a little differently. I didn't necessarily have to move across the country. I could have changed my life. I could have gone into college and not made my kids have to move, but it is what it is. And,
well, at some time in life, sometimes in life, you just have to make decisions, I mean, hindsight's 20/20, and you can't always, we all look back and say, oh, I wish I would have done this or that differently. But yeah. You were in a pinch. I mean, you were in a very difficult situation. And
I actually ended up in the hospital from an anxiety attack because I was so stressed out about the whole situation and thinking of what it was like to live as a single mom and all that. So I was only a single mom for 6 months. I rented an apartment before I moved in with Ian. So I originally hadn't planned on moving in with Ian, but the apartment that I was renting fell through. So we ended up living together, which was quite a challenge, blending young kids in the same family. It's a really, really big challenge. And I didn't know anybody who was doing that. Most people, when they get married, usually one of the partners has kids that are older. And so, you only have one partner's kids that are in the house. So it's very rare to find families that actually do try to blend them when they're young. And it's a lot of work.
What helped you get through this time?
My brother's encouragement, and Ian, my new husband now, he's was very liberal in his Christianity, and so he was not from that fundamentalist background. He was not a misogynist. He was not a chauvinist. He, was kind and considerate. And I started to see that there could be men out there that were kind and considerate. And so that was super, super helpful. Yeah. So those two people in my life, a few friends that I've met along the way, but it's been a very lonely path for sure.
It makes me really happy to hear that your brother was such an encouragement and such a help to you, and of course your husband. Now, I just think that's so neat. You guys reconnected. That's such a happy ending. And I wanted to ask, when you think back on your entire, experience being a Christian from the time you were 7.5 years old and starting in that really strict school, all the way through those mission years, raising your kids, and then deconverting and losing your faith and becoming an atheist. What about you stayed the same through that entire time?
Actually, I was thinking about this recently, because when I first left Christianity, I would think, why can't these Christian, my past friends be friends with me? I'm not riding a Harley Davidson. I didn't go get a lot of tattoos. I'm not a drug dealer, because those, were all black and white sins that I would see non-Christians do. So I sort of classified myself in with this broad brush, that, I'm not doing those things, so people should still be friends with me. But I didn't realize how my morals and ethics had changed, and realizing I can't be friends with them. Instead of pointing the finger, why aren't they still friends with me? So I can't be friends with them because they are what I used to be, which was a bigoted, homophobic, racist, judgmental person. And I don't want to be that person anymore. I'm still learning what it means to not be racist, to not be bigoted, to look at a gay couple and not be offended by it. I'm still learning what that means after 40 years of being told that's horrible.
Yeah.
So I have definitely changed. I'm a better person now because I have respect for my kids. I used to not respect them at all. I have respect for everybody in the world in a way that I used to never have, before. So, but I'm still, trying to learn how to put that into practice in terms of how does that relate to my neighbors and how does that relate to the person I meet in the grocery store. But I am definitely a better person overall than, even though people will look at me and think, oh, you were a wonderful Christian, you look at all these things you did. But at the heart of it, I was, very judgmental and not a kind person.
Yeah, and so when you look back, that's kind of how you view the the Christian version of yourself. But do you think there was any common thread, like through the years, something good that you see in yourself that you can identify when you look back through your life that stayed the same through all those big transitions?
That was probably your first question you asked. I was thinking of the things that were different.
You answered the second one already, so that's fine. That's fine.
Different order.
Yeah.
What stayed the same? I still have a sense of, being in service of other people and helping other people and being a helper. I still have, I don't know, I think I still have a sense of some of the morals that even though I don't agree at all with Bill Gothard's, the way he teaches certain things, but we were really, really into Bill Gothard, and we used to play, when most people are playing Monopoly, we would play that once in a while, but we were playing a game that Bill Gothard had created called Character Sketches or Character Clues, and it was memorizing all of the virtues and the good character traits that you're supposed to have, such as creativity and helpfulness and thankfulness and thoughtfulness and all these different things. And there was, we'd memorized the definitions of them, and so I think those things have stayed with me. So, but I think I could have learned those outside of the church, because I have a lot of non-Christian friends now that I'm starting to interact with who have those traits, and they didn't learn them in the church. So I think that's where humanism comes in to say, these things can be learned outside of, outside of the Bible and outside of, that Christian setting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. So what do you think's the best thing about being an atheist?
Oh my goodness. I love having freedom to not be guilty about everything. I love swearing and not, feeling, somebody's looking over my shoulder. I love being able to take all the rules away from my kids. I love being able to not go to church on a Sunday morning. I love to just have no rules that I have to follow, and taking all the rules away, like I say, for my kids, so that they are allowed to live the life they want to live, and that it's not based on me telling them what to do. And I love, not having guilt. So I love being an atheist. It's so easy. It's so easy compared to, the old life. And I'll take loneliness any day over ever going back. I could never go back. You couldn't pay me, billions of dollars to ever go back to that, because I'll, being under that cloud of guilt and shame and sin and all of those things is so horrible to think about now, that I just love having that freedom to not have that anymore. And my relationships with my kids is 1,000 times better than it ever was before, because I see them as an equal. I see them as other humans. I'm a human, they're a human, and there's not this category that they have to be under me and they have to be obeying me and any of that kind of thing. So
that's really great.
So much freedom. It's just unbelievable.
Well, and you have a husband who does the dishes.
Yes, my husband does the dishes and he cooks and he's yes, and having that equality with a husband is just so wonderful. I can't imagine ever going back to that again.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, he actually does more grocery shopping than I do, even, and does the laundry. Like we do, if he's cooked a couple suppers, well, it's my turn to cook suppers. We, oh, you've done the dishes. Okay. It's my turn to do dishes. Like we just sort of, there's no competition and there's no men's work, women's work kind of a thing. It's such freedom. It's wonderful.
Does it feel refreshing?
Oh yeah. It's wonderful. Wonderful.
And speaking of all those great things you mentioned about not having guilt and, being able to have Sundays to yourself and you don't have to be so strict with your kids. Do you feel like you're I felt this way, but do you feel like it's like kind of like a rediscovering of life?
Yes and no. I still realize I have a lot of hangups. Like my kids wanted me to do pot last Christmas, and I was so scared because I thought, okay, doing drugs is evil. That's a sin. You're not allowed to, pollute your temple, which is your body. All these silly things. And, I tried to smoke a cigarette a couple years ago and, coughed too much. I've tried to get drunk and I can't get through more than one cider without feeling guilty. So I want to get to that place where I can feel free to do all these things that my kids, totally feel free to do, because this is their life and they don't feel any hangups. But I still realize I've got a lot of hangups. So I'm proud of myself for getting past some hurdles that, I could never have gotten over even a couple years ago. My kids will say, "What, you watched that movie? You would have never watched that movie before," so getting, past watching X-rated movies. And I still find it hard to watch porn. The only time I ever watched porn was for those 6 months that I was a single mom. No one's looking over my shoulder.
Yeah.
But porn was such a taboo subject. And so I still don't ever watch porn. That's still like a taboo in my own brain, even though I don't care if my husband watches porn. I don't care if my kids watch porn. It doesn't matter. It's like a non-issue anymore. But I still have some of these hangups for myself that I'll get there. I'm trying to be patient with myself. And like I think I was mentioning to Cass in that interview, listening to comedies. I used to be so offended by Bill Burr or I'm trying to remember some of the other comedians.
Like Louis C.K. or Chris Rock or Dave Chappelle.
Louis C.K. And even watching the Friends, I'm sort of binge watching Friends, and the Friends episodes were, from the 90s into the 2000s. But I mean, I was in the middle of Brazil as a missionary. I never ever watched Friends. And if I had, I would have been very offended because, they talk about sex and they swear and there's people having babies out of wedlock. It was so taboo. And it's so free now to watch it. So in some ways, yes, I am going back and reliving those, my 20s that I never had.
Yeah.
It's very freeing. So I'm trying to be patient with myself and get to that point. So yeah, I hope to get drunk someday.
That's great. I love that that's on your to-do list.
But I look at my kids and I envy them, having the option of having a one night stand if they want it, and having the option of going out and getting totally wasted and throwing up at their friend's house. Like I don't have that option. Like I'm not going to be able to do that, but I can do the 40-year-old version of it, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and what I love about it is you get to define that. You don't have someone high up above you or even a husband telling you,
No.
You need to do this, you can't do that,
No, that's right.
All these rules. You get to talk to your husband and your kids and your friends and say, and think about it yourself and say, am I okay with this thing or am I not? Do I want to do this thing or do I not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's so much healthier,
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many rules we had growing up that actually that even couldn't have been classified as sin, but they were seen as sin, and we, were disciplined them. And yet now sin isn't even a word that's not even part of my life, because to me, sin is all related to religion. So just having those kind of freedoms is just wonderful.
I was just going to say, it was so freeing for me when I didn't have to tell my kids that they're sinful little beings, born sinful, that they need forgiveness for taking an extra cookie or for not sharing their toy. It's like, it was I deconverted when my kids were about 3 and 4. So we had been praying with them and reading Bible stories to them, and they were watching VeggieTales and all these Christian shows. And it pretty much just stopped. I mean, they'd still watch VeggieTales and stuff because they didn't know what, there wasn't a real strong Christian message necessarily. Yeah. I was very happy to not have to, indoctrinate them with that, what I think is a horrible thing to teach a child, that they're bad the way they are,
Yeah. No, then taking all the rules away also helped my kids experience life anew. Like when we first came back from Brazil, we just had Brazilian TV down there, for instance, and they had never seen VeggieTales. SpongeBob SquarePants. They had watched lots of VeggieTales, but not SpongeBob. So, my 12-year-old, and even when they were 13 and 14, here we're all at home watching SpongeBob, which is, what most little kids watch. So, those kinds of things, and slowly taking the rules away, that because I was very much a helicopter parent, because that's what the good Christian parents were, monitoring everything your kids do. And to take that away and to go pick them up at midnight and they were both totally drunk and not care about that anymore. And to get to that point where it's like, this doesn't matter. This is what teenagers are supposed to do. So it's fun to see them do that. And they've forgiven me, for being such a strict mom, I think, because I was pretty bad.
It sounded like when I listened to your interview with your daughter on your podcast, that you guys just have a really good relationship.
Yeah, I couldn't have asked for, better kids. They're wonderful. And my 2 stepkids, we've had some rocky times, but they're great kids too. So yeah, we're in such a better place than we would have ever been if I'd stayed in the church. I cringe at thinking of what that would have turned out like.
It genuinely makes me so happy to hear that. Just knowing what you went through and hearing all of the whole story. It's so nice to know, and I think that's just such a great message for people who are deconverting right now, that it gets better, and sometimes it gets a lot better. And there's hangups and there's very difficult things we have to work through, but there's really positive things to look forward to in life.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Oh, very much so.
When you think back on your deconversion experience, what are you most proud of?
I think it is my relationship with my kids. Growing up in the family I grew up in, my mom's whole goal in life was to be a wife and a mother. And so that's what my goal in life was. And so my kids were absolutely everything to me. Honestly, having the podcast I have now is the first time that I felt like either I wasn't serving God or serving my kids, to actually have something outside of the family that I could, focus on. And so, yeah, I think it has been the biggest change for me. Yeah, I don't know.
That's huge, though, Wendy. I mean,
Yeah.
that's our relationships with the people closest to us. I mean, there's almost nothing more important in life than that. So that's a great answer to that question, I think.
Yeah. Well, and my husband, my relationship with my husband is really strong. And but actually, when we blended our family, we both said, our kids come first. This is a second marriage. We had our kids before we met each other, and our kids have come first in our life. And if our kids needed us to separate, then we would have separated. But I think we're over the worst part of blending a family, and we're on to the better and bigger things.
Cool.
So yeah, he's an excellent man. So
is there anything that we haven't discussed or anything that you wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to?
No, I think I've told everybody enough stuff. But I appreciate you, Steve, and I appreciate this podcast that you're starting. And I encourage you in where the future holds for you. And I really hope that people get behind you and support you. And it's great. It's great what you're doing.
Yeah, and you as well. And I was going to ask. So I this, but I started this podcast for the Christian who's just recently deconverted. So what encouragement or piece of guidance would you give that person?
Just keep asking questions. I think that's the best thing, because your questions will lead you to the truth and will lead you to freedom, I think. And the more you question, the more you Google, the more you ask, where does this lead? Then I think that's the healthiest thing. As soon as you stop questioning, then you get closed-minded. And so the more you question, the more things that you start to study and broaden your sphere of topics that you want to study. I think that's the best thing for people who are deconverting. I actually have gotten a few emails from people who are in the deconversion process since I started this podcast, asking me that kind of a question. And that's what I would recommend. Just start listening to other people's podcasts, start reading blogs, reading books, look at YouTube videos, like the God virus and things like that. And I think that's the best thing for people who are starting to ask questions.
Yeah. And you mentioned a few things, a few resources, but is there one or two that you would recommend for someone who's deconverting? And maybe specifically for women?
Oh, well, I could put a shameless plug out for my podcast.
Oh, well, you should. So if you don't, I will.
It's actually fun that I can do that. I mean, two months ago, before I started the podcast, I don't know what I would have recommended. I guess, Seth Andrews, I think has had the biggest influence overall, just because he has so much content, his videos and his podcasts. And he definitely is a man who agrees with feminist ideals and women's rights. But there's a lot of other people who, are good influences and can assist a woman who is deconverting as well, that doesn't have a trigger, with chauvinism or whatever. Like I say, I'm a podcast junkie, so podcast would be the first thing. But yeah, I think the God virus was really impactful to me to watch that on YouTube.
Oh, I had not heard of that.
Yeah, it's Richard Dawkins.
Oh, okay.
And I would watch debates with Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, and actually the one with the four horsemen, the debate, I think it's the last debate that they have together, all four of them, Sam Harris and
Hitchens and Dennett and Dawkins.
Yeah. And so those are good. Seth Andrews has some speeches. So those kinds of things are very, very helpful. Because, I mean, when you leave the church, you don't have a pastor anymore. So you don't have, that same kind of instruction. So you sort of have to find your own pastors in that way. Not that we call them pastors, but people who are going to be influential in your life. I haven't looked that hard, but I haven't found very many women out there that are as dynamic as those people. But I'm sure they're out there. I'm just starting to get familiar with the atheist movement in general. So Yeah, I think that's a few.
Well, and of course, like you said, the Women Beyond Belief podcast. So where can people find that?
It's at womenbeyondbelief.com. And also you can people can email me at womenbeyondbelief@gmail.com. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest, all those places too.
That's wonderful. Well, Wendy, thank you for taking so much time to talk to me. I know my podcasts can go really long, but I really enjoyed hearing your story, and thank you so much for sharing it with me today. I really appreciated it, and I know so many people listening will really, really get a lot out of it.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. I appreciate you asking me to come on, and I appreciate your encouragement of my podcast. And thank you very much. Thank you for having women on your podcast too, in terms of getting an equal voice in there. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.